Okay, I hope I didn't. I had a little bit of a goof there, hopefully. Okay, so now we're actually getting into the first verse of the New Testament, as it's arranged in our Bibles. I really did want to read Matthew first. I read Mark first. I really did want to read Matthew first. It's a very fitting continuation from the Old Testament. After spending all that time doing such a deep dive of the Old Testament, I felt it would have been appropriate to move right into Matthew, which is a very, very, very fitting continuation from the Old Testament, especially this first verse here. Then Mark is just so much easier, so much simpler, so much easier. It's such a good starting point because of that. It makes Mark endears itself very well to being read first because it is so much easier to read and get through. And then you can build on from that with Matthew, Luke, and John. And there was an argument to be made, of course, like I said, that Mark was first in written order, at least in terms of the events of Jesus' life. So I ended up going with Mark first, but I would have liked to have gone with Matthew first, because this first passage of Matthew is a very, 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 very fitting first verse of the New Testament and continuation of the Old. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now that is what we want to hear. This is the guy that we've been, right there, right from the very beginning, the first verse of the New Testament. We have identified explicitly that this is the guy that we've been waiting for. This is the Christ, the Anointed One. This is the Son of David. This is the guy that all those Psalms, we read the Psalms last in the Old Testament. And all those Psalms, well, not all of them, I guess, but those Psalms as a whole were about the King. They were about the coming King. Some of them are about David himself. But they all basically put together as a whole, they were all about looking forward to this coming king, the one who would be like David, who would be greater than David, the king that God would send that would finally finish the job and set Israel on top and set the world to right. And it was going to be a son of David, and this is that guy. He is finally here. This is the son of David that we have been waiting for. 2 Samuel, chapter 7. Second Samuel 7. Let's start in verse 6. Let's see here. 8. Now then, tell my servant David, 2 Samuel 7, starting in verse 8. David has expressed his desire to build God a house. David himself is now in a house. He is king over Israel. He has a palace. He has a house. He has a nice house. God is still living in a tabernacle. He's still living in a tent. This bothers David. David is bothered by the fact that he's living in a nice fancy house now that he's king, a nice fancy palace, and that God is still living out of a tent. That bothers David. So he wants to build God a house. God will not actually let David do this. He will have his son do it instead. But he slightly rebukes David for this desire because God himself never asked for a house. God doesn't need a house. God's entire world is, his house, even the entire world can't hold him as his house. Like, God doesn't need a house. He never asked for a house. But he does respect David's desire to honor him. And even though he will not allow him to build the temple himself, he is going to bless him and do this for him instead. Starting 2 Samuel 7, starting in verse 8. Now then, tell my servant David, he's talking to the prophet Nathan, who carried the king's request to God. Actually, he didn't. He skipped that part and just told the king to go ahead and build a house. And then God came to the prophet and told him to give this message to the king. So anyway, now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now, I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth. Now, this was how they lived forever. Remember, back in their day, they didn't necessarily believe in have any basis for a belief in a resurrection yet, because God hadn't told them he was going to do that for them yet. The way they lived forever in their minds was to make their names live forever, to make their names great. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and as they've been doing for 1,000 years since. Okay, David lived about 1,000 years before Christ. So in the times of the people who lived in Jesus' day, they're still being oppressed. And they want this king, they want this passage to finally come true for them. And have done ever since the time I appointed leaders of my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. David wanted to build God a house, but God is going to build David a house. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Now that applies somewhat to Solomon and somewhat to Jesus. Solomon was the one who actually built the temple, the physical house of God in that day. Jesus will establish his kingdom forever. That, of course, was written before the fall of the kingdom and the fall of the temple at the hands of the Babylonians. The Chronicles was written later, after they came back from exile, and it has a little bit different spin on this promise. 1 Chronicles 17, starting in verse 7. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Just remember, this would have been written after the exile, after they had come back from the exile, after the temple would have been destroyed and rebuilt. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name like the names of the greatest men of the earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also subdue all your enemies. In the days of the New Testament, that hadn't happened yet. They were subdued by the Romans. They wanted that to change. They wanted this king to come, so his promise would come true, so that they would then have rest on their enemies and not be controlled by them. I declare to you that the Lord will build a house for you. When your days are over and you go to be with your fathers, I will raise up one of your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will never take my love away from him, as I took it away from your predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. My house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever. We read also earlier on, but we're going to read a little bit of it again here, that whenever they would anoint a new king, crown a new king, this is the song they would sing, Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and their rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chain. By the way, anointed is the word where we get the word Christ from. Christ and Messiah. Christ is Greek, Messiah is Hebrew. Means anointed. Now this is referring to the king. This is referring to the son of David, the kings of Israel, and Judah, actually. But its ultimate fulfillment is in Jesus, this guy we're introducing here in Matthew 1. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have become your father. And ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, kings of the earth, be wise, be warned, ye rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you be destroyed in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Now, I was referring to the kings that came and went during their history. The real goal was to get to that one king who would come and establish the throne forever. The prophets talked about this too. We could mention a lot of different passages. Well, we'll mention just a couple here, because we'd be here all day. In Isaiah 9, now Isaiah 9 is the end of, well, not the end, but the continuation of a passage that started in Isaiah 7. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We read about that, of course, we read Isaiah. But Isaiah 7 begins with a confrontation between Isaiah and the king at the time, King Ahaz, who was the wicked king, who at that moment in time was being confronted by an alliance of two other kings, the king of Israel, who was his enemy at that point. This is the king of Judah, and the king of Israel, who was his enemy, and the king of Israel made an alliance with the king of Aram, who was also his enemy, and they were teaming up against Ahaz, king of Judah, who was a wicked king. Okay, but he was still a member of the line of David, and God was not going to let his line fall at that point in time. So he had given he had Isaiah tell the king, and this is Isaiah 7, to ask for a sign that would assure from God, that would assure him that these two kings who are attacking him are not going to bother him. And he said no, and Isaiah gave him the sign anyway. And that leads on to this whole section here, which follows up in Isaiah 8 and 9 about this sign and about the assurance they have that the king of Aram and the king of Israel are not going to defeat the king of Judah. And the sign that ends up being given to Ahaz, which he didn't ask for, was a sign that a virgin would give birth to a child. And that child, by the time that child is a certain age, before he even knows how to right from wrong, so before he's too old, the two kings that are currently bothering Ahaz would be gone. And that's the context of 7, 8, and 9. And that virgin was, by the way, probably Isaiah's wife, or a young woman pledged to be married to him who gave birth. But we'll read about that when we apply that prophecy to Mary later on in Jesus. But in this case, it refers to probably the birth of Isaiah's own son. But in Isaiah 9, he's talking about, let's start in verse 2. We'll come back to this later in another context, but right now we want to get down to, actually, you know what, we'll come back to that part later in another context. Let's just go down to verse 6. And it says, For to us a child is born. This is a common Christmas verse. You hear this in a lot of Sunday school Christmas programs. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Ezekiel 34. This is after the fall. This is after the exile. This is during that time after the temple has been destroyed and the city has fallen, the people have been exiled, and before they come back. Okay, this is when they're really down the dumps and have no hope. but they don't think they have any. Ezekiel 34. We'll read this again later too, in the context of the Good Shepherd. But right now I just want to start and say, in verse 20, therefore this is what the Sovereign Lord says. Say to them, see, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. We'll read this passage later in context of the shepherd. Because you shove the flank and shoulder, because you shove with flank and shoulder, butting all the weak sheep with your horn. He's talking to the bad shepherds of Israel. I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between them, judge between one sheep and another. I'll place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant shepherd will be present prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. And we could mention a bunch of other things. You know, the root of Jesse, the stump that comes up from the tree of Jesse, the branch, the branch. But this is the guy. We've been waiting for this dude. We've been waiting for him ever since God promised to build a house for David 1,000 years ago, and all the prophets have come along since then. Even during the exile, even before, when Israel was sinking, Judah, I should say, was sinking into the apostasy and sinking into idolatry, and even when that led them to the exile and the temple was destroyed, this is still going on. They want a king. They're going to get a king. And it's going to be, and this is the guy. This is the guy. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Two more genealogies to get. This is what all the genealogies were there for. Okay. In the end, all those genealogies that we read throughout the Old Testament are here to set this up, so that we know that Jesus is of the right genealogy. Matthew's going to give us one, and then Luke is going to give us one. And then we're finally done with the genealogies. We don't have to worry about them anymore after that. But we needed those in order to prove that Jesus is a descendant of Abraham. He's a son of Adam. I mean, he's a member of the human race. Okay, Luke will take his ancestry all the way back to Adam. So he's a son of Adam. He's a member of the human race. He's a son of Abraham. He's a Jew. He's a child of the physical descent of Abraham, the son of David. He's in the kingly line. He is fully qualified to be king, and he is the anointed one. He is the Messiah. So we needed all those genealogies for these last two, one in Matthew, one in Luke, to prove that Jesus Christ is this figure. He is qualified to be the representative of the human race before God, to be king over the human race, to be the true human being, to be the ruler of God's new creation, ruling on the throne of David and fulfilling all these promises to Adam, to Abraham, and to David. God made a promise to Adam way back in Genesis 3. He made promises to Abraham in Genesis 12, to David in 2 Samuel 7, and Jesus is going to fulfill all those. And we've been tracing this genealogy all the way from Genesis 4 and following, and it's going to find its fulfillment here finally in the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, to establish that Jesus is this figure. This ultimately goes all the way back to the seed promise in the garden in Genesis 3. So that's what those genealogies were for. Now, they used it for other reasons too. The Jews needed these, especially when they returned from exile, and we read all those genealogies and chronicles. They needed that to establish their family lines of inheritance and the roles of the priest, establish who was the priest and who were the Levites and who could do what. Okay? That doesn't matter to us anymore. Okay? It doesn't. I mean, that genuinely doesn't matter to us anymore. But the full final purpose of these genealogies ultimately is what we're going to read right here in Luke, to demonstrate all the qualifications that Jesus had to fulfill all these promises that God ever made. to humans, to the Adamic race. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. This would be familiar. We've read all this before many times. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Aminadab. Aminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Rahab and Ruth, we read about these. We read all this before. We read about this in Genesis. We read about this. The whole book of Ruth is about Boaz and Ruth. Okay. Apparently Rahab from Joshua was a father or the mother, or at least maybe a grandmother, potentially, of Boaz, excuse me. And Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of King David. Now, we need to understand right here and now that these genealogies don't necessarily have to be complete. In fact, they're not complete, because as we continue to read, we're going to compare this to some of our other lists and the other genealogical lists in the Old Testament, and find out that Matthew is skipping generations here, and he's doing that for a reason, which we'll point out when we get done. So that itself shows to us that the genealogies are not complete. Okay, so even when you go back to the Old Testament, the genealogies don't necessarily need to be taken as being complete. These genealogies are not complete. Matthew is purposely going to skip generations for a reason, as we'll see. And that's fine. In his mind, that's fine. It's fine to do that. So that tells us right then and there that the other lists that we see throughout the Old Testament don't have to be complete either. So those genealogical lists do not give us enough information to accurately date the age of the earth, and they should not be taken as that. We've made that point before, though. We're making it one more time here. And we'll make it one final time when we go through the genealogical listings in Luke. David was the father of Solomon, and these are going to be the kings here. These are the actual kings. All those Psalm, that Psalm 2 that we say that we read and we read before. These are the guys that those songs were sung about when they became king. Now, of course, the song ultimately has fulfillment in Jesus, but in the time in which that psalm book was being sung initially, it would have referred to these guys. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. By the way, all the women who are mentioned in this genealogy are not Jews. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba all have foreign blood in them. Bathsheba was Hittite, Ruth was Moabite, Rahab was from Jericho, and Tamar, I forget actually what Tamar was from. Does it mention? This Genesis 38. Probably a Canaanite woman. In Genesis 38:6, Judah got a wife for his son. Her name is Tamar, probably from the Canaanite women nearby. So they're all foreigners. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam was the father of Abijah. Abijah was the father of Asa. Asa was the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was the father of Jehoram. Jehoram was the father of Uzziah. Uzziah was the father of Jotham. Jotham was the father of Ahaz. Ahaz was the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the father of Manasseh. Manasseh was the father of Amon. Amon was the father of Josiah. And Josiah was the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. We're going to flip back over to 1 Chronicles 3, and we're going to see something here. The kings of Judah, according to 1 Chronicles 3. Of course, we could go back and read the entire history recorded in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. We could do that. We're not going to. But we could. The kings of Judah. 1 Chronicles 3, starting in verse... where are we here? 10. Solomon's son was Rehoboam. His son was Abijah. His son was Asa. His son was Jehoshaphat. His son was Jehoram. His son was Ahaziah. His son was Joash. His son was Amaziah. His son was Azariah. His son was Jotham. His son was Ahaz. His son was Hezekiah. His son was Manasseh. His son was Amon. His son was Josiah. If you'll notice here, there were a couple names in that list that Matthew didn't include in his. We have David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, then we have Uzziah, who is Azariah in 1 Chronicles. So Matthew skips Amaziah and moves straight down to Azariah, who is also Uzziah. And then Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amon, Josiah. So he skips a generation. Now he did that for a purpose. He did that for a reason. But that shows us there that these genealogical listings do not necessarily have to be full and complete, and we should not take them to be such. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. We read about these guys in the post-exile books of the Old Testament. Zerubbabel, the father of Abiud. Abiud, the father of Eliakim. That's pretty much where the Old Testament chronology ends. After this, the names we see from here on are going to be in that gap of time between 400 or so BC and now, 5 BC or whatever, or well, really 30 BC when Joseph was born. So we don't know anything about these guys other than what we read here in these lists. Eliakim, the father of Azor. Azor, the father of Zadok. Zadok, the father of Akim. Akim, the father of Eliud. Eliud, the father of Eleazar. Eleazar, the father of Mathan. Mathan, the father of Jacob. And Jacob, the father of Joseph. Another Jacob and Joseph, interestingly enough. The husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Matthew is careful to say that Joseph is not actually the father of Christ, but he is the husband of Mary, of whom was born Christ. This is very clearly Joseph's genealogy. Most likely Luke, who has a different set of names, will give us Mary's genealogy. This is very clearly Joseph's. Now Joseph, of course, would have been the adopted father of Christ. But Christ did not come out of Jacob's body, or Joseph's body. He did, however, come out of Mary's. And Mary herself was also a descendant of David. So Christ is a descendant of David on both his father and mother's side, as we'll read about when we read Mary's listing in Luke. This is Joseph's listing. Joseph was the adopted father of Christ, not the biological father of Christ. Christ did not come from his body. We read about in 2 Samuel how important it was to have your son come from your own body. Okay, that meant a lot to them. He talks to us today still too. It meant even more to these people back then. Well, it won't come from Joseph's body. Christ did not come from Joseph's body, but he did come from Mary's. And Mary herself was a full-blooded descendant of David. So that promise still applies there in that case. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham. This is why he skipped those generations. He wanted to make this point. There were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile of Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Christ. Well, we've already established there were actually more than 14. I don't know about the period between the exile and Christ because we don't have the data for the 400 years in between, but we know there was at least one generation he skipped from the kings. So there were more than 14. But he is using this. It's actually important. And this is a clue that the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. Because 14 is actually a pretty important number, since David's name, okay, in Hebrew, the characters function as both letters and numbers. And so the number of a name is the sum total of all of the value of all the letters / numbers that make up that name. David's name in Hebrew, in our English letters, would be DVD because they didn't have vowels. And I don't know how you count it exactly because I'm not proficient in Hebrew, but those letters DVD added up, whatever their numeric values are, added up to 14. Okay, so the repetitiveness of 14, 14, 14 is intended to drive home the point that Jesus is in fact the son of David. And that is why he skipped genealogies in his listing, because he needed to get each grouping, each of these chronological groupings, to 14 to emphasize the point that this is in fact, 14 is David's number, and he's just driving home further the fact that this is the son of David. This is the guy we've been waiting for. Now in Greek this means nothing. In every other language but Hebrew this means nothing. So this is itself a pretty significant clue that the Gospel of Hebrew, or the writing that would become the Gospel of Matthew as we have it now, was originally written in Hebrew.